Thomas Wilson entered the Royal Oak with the confidence of someone who owned the world. His expensive watch caught the light as he adjusted his navy silk tie. At 55, his silver hair was perfectly styled, and his Italian shoes gleamed against the polished floor. The restaurant manager hurried over, bowing slightly. "Mr. Wilson, always a pleasure. Your usual table is ready." Thomas barely acknowledged him with a nod. He was used to this treatment. After building London's most successful luxury car dealership chain from nothing, he expected the best. People whispered as he passed. They knew his name, his wealth, his power. Across the room sat the Clark family. Robert Clark wore his best suit slightly tight around the shoulders. He had bought it 3 years ago for special occasions. His wife Olivia had spent an hour getting ready, her dark hair styled elegantly, wearing the pearl necklace Robert had given her on their 10th anniversary. Their children, Emily and James, sat up straight, trying to follow the example of the other diners. "This place is amazing, Dad," whispered Emily, her eyes wide at the crystal glasses and fine china. Robert smiled warmly. "You deserve to see places like this. One day you'll be comfortable anywhere you go." The family had saved for 6 months for this dinner. Robert's promotion to senior physician had been hard-earned through years of night shifts and missed weekends. Tonight was their reward. Thomas noticed the Clark family while scanning the room. His eyes narrowed. He watched as Robert helped Olivia with her chair, as James awkwardly handled the fancy silverware. Thomas felt a sudden irritation rise in his chest. "Harold!" Thomas's voice cut through the soft music and gentle conversations. "The restaurant," manager rushed over. "I thought this establishment had standards about who dines here." The words hung in the air. Nearby tables fell silent. "Some people clearly don't belong in places like this," Thomas continued, loud enough for everyone to hear. The silence spread through the restaurant like spilled wine. Forks paused mid-air. Conversations died. Eyes shifted uncomfortably. Olivia's hand trembled as she set down her water glass. A small splash escaped onto the white tablecloth. Emily and James froze, their faces burning with shame. Robert kept his eyes on his plate, his jaw tight, his shoulders squared. "Dad?" James whispered, his voice small. "It's all right," Robert said, quietly. "Enjoy your meal. Don't let anyone take this moment from you." But the damage was done. The joy had vanished from their celebration. Emily's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Olivia reached under the table to squeeze her husband's hand. William Parker watched from his station near the kitchen. At 23, he had been working at the Royal Oak for 3 years, saving every pound for his medical school tuition. He had seen Mr. Wilson's behavior before. The demands, the complaints, the way he spoke to staff. But this was different. William looked at the Clark family trying to continue their meal with dignity. He saw how they spoke softly to each other, forcing smiles, pretending not to notice the stares. He saw Robert gently encouraging his children to try the fancy food to keep their heads up. At the next table, an elderly couple exchanged disapproving glances. A woman in a red dress whispered something to her companion. No one said anything directly to Thomas Wilson. He was too important, too wealthy, too connected. William thought of his grandmother who had raised him after his parents died. "Remember, Billy," she would say, "true character shows in how you treat others when no one important is watching." She had worked as a cleaner all her life, but carried herself with more grace than anyone William had ever met. Tonight, everyone was watching. The restaurant had become a stage, with Thomas Wilson playing the villain and the Clark family forced into silent suffering. William served Thomas's table with professional courtesy, though his hands shook slightly with anger. He watched Thomas laugh loudly with his business associates, occasionally glancing toward the Clark family with disdain. When William approached the Clark's table with water refills, he saw Robert helping Emily choose a dessert, pointing out options on the menu with enthusiasm that seemed forced. "The chocolate soufflé is our best dessert," William said warmly. "It takes a bit longer to prepare, but it's worth the wait." "What do you think, Emily?" Robert asked, his voice steady despite everything. "That sounds nice," Emily replied softly. William nodded with a smile and turned away. As he passed the kitchen, he made a decision. Thomas Wilson might be the restaurant's most valued customer, but some things mattered more than tips and job security. William remembered a story from the local newspaper. 3 years ago, there had been a terrible accident at the London Underground. One doctor had worked for 16 hours without rest, saving 6 lives. William had kept the article because the story had inspired him to pursue medicine. Now looking at Dr. Robert Clark, William wondered if this could be the same man from the article. He needed to find out, and if he was right, Thomas Wilson needed to know exactly who he had just humiliated. William moved between tables with practiced steps, balancing trays and filling glasses, while the tension hung heavy in the air. Every time he approached the Clark family's table, he noticed how they leaned closer together, like trees bending in a storm. Robert spoke quietly to his children, his voice steady despite the hurt in his eyes. "We have every right to be here," Robert whispered, gently squeezing James's shoulder. "Hold your head high." Emily nodded but kept her eyes down. Olivia reached across to straighten her daughter's necklace, a small gesture of normalcy in this uncomfortable moment. At Thomas Wilson's table, the expensive wine flowed freely. William served their appetizers, delicate scallops arranged like petals on black plates. As he leaned forward to place Thomas's plate, he caught fragments of conversation. "Standards these days," Thomas muttered to his associates, swirling his wine. "They let anyone in anywhere now. The manager should know better." William's hand almost slipped, but years of training kept the plate steady. He stepped back with a polite, "Enjoy your meal, sir," that tasted bitter in his mouth. As he turned away, something caught his eye. On Robert Clark's jacket lapel was a small, distinct pin he hadn't noticed before. The pin was gold with a red cross, the Royal Medical Service medal. William had seen it only in pictures, knowing it was awarded for extraordinary service. Few doctors ever received one. The sight of the medal stirred a memory. 3 years ago, when William had just started at the Royal Oak, there had been a terrible accident. A train had derailed near Paddington Station. The news had covered it for weeks. During his break, William slipped into the staff room and pulled out his phone with trembling fingers. He typed, "Paddington Train Accident Dr. Hero" into the search bar. The articles appeared instantly, and there it was, a photograph of a doctor receiving an award. The caption read, "Dr. Robert Clark, honored for saving 6 lives during the Paddington disaster." William scrolled through the article, his heart pounding. Dr. Clark had worked for 16 hours straight after the crash, treating victims in dangerous conditions. He had crawled into the wreckage to reach trapped passengers when others had deemed it too risky. Among those he saved was the son of a prominent businessman. Another article showed a photograph of the businessman tearfully thanking the doctor who had saved his son. William zoomed in on the image, his breath caught in his throat. The businessman was Thomas Wilson. The article quoted Thomas saying, "I owe this man everything. My son Peter would have died without his courage. I offered him any reward he wanted, but he refused. He only asked that I pass on kindness to others in need." William sat back, stunned. The man who had just publicly humiliated the Clark family was the same man who had once pledged eternal gratitude to Dr. Clark. Had Thomas truly not recognized him, or had he simply forgotten both the face and the promise he had made? Back in the dining room, William watched Thomas laugh loudly while the Clark family tried to salvage what remained of their special evening. Robert was cutting his steak into careful pieces, showing James how to hold his knife properly. Even now he was teaching, caring, being the man who had risked his life to save others. William thought about his own path. He was working at the Royal Oak to pay for medical school. He wanted to be a doctor like Robert Clark, someone who made a difference, but what kind of doctor would he be if he couldn't even stand up for what was right? The restaurant manager caught William's eye and gestured toward a table needing service. William nodded, but his mind was racing. If he confronted Thomas Wilson, he would almost certainly lose his job. 3 years of tips and double shifts would be wasted. His tuition payments would fall behind. But then he looked at Emily's downcast eyes, at Olivia's brave smile, at Robert's quiet dignity. He thought of his grandmother's words again. "True character shows in how you treat others when no one important is watching." Tonight, everyone was watching. And William realized that This moment would define him more than any medical degree ever could. He took a pen from his pocket and a small notepad used for orders. His hand was steady now as he wrote. Some things were more important than a paycheck. Some moments required courage. Mr. Wilson may have forgotten, William thought, as he carefully folded the note. But I'm going to help him remember. William's hands were steady, but his heart pounded as he carefully wrote on his notepad. Each word felt important, like stones being laid in a path he couldn't turn back from. His handwriting was neater than usual as he formed the words that might cost him his job. The man you just humiliated is Dr. Robert Clark. 3 years ago he worked for 16 hours straight after the Paddington train crash and saved your son Peter's life. He refused any reward and only asked that you show kindness to others. I wonder what Peter would think of how you're treating his doctor tonight. William read the note once more, then folded it carefully. He picked up a small silver tray that was normally used for presenting bills to guests. The note looked small against the polished surface. For a moment he hesitated. 3 years of saving for medical school hung in the balance, but then he remembered Emily's sad eyes and Robert's quiet dignity. William took a deep breath and walked toward Thomas Wilson's table. The wealthy man was laughing loudly at something one of his business friends had said. The men clinked their expensive wine glasses together. None of them noticed William approaching until he was right beside them. "Sir, this is for you," William said quietly. He placed the silver tray next to Thomas's wine glass, careful not to disturb anything on the table. Thomas looked up, clearly annoyed at the interruption. His eyes narrowed at William, then at the folded note on the tray. "What's this?" Thomas asked sharply. "Just something for your attention, sir," William replied, stepping back slightly. Thomas picked up the note with 2 fingers, as though touching something unpleasant. He unfolded it impatiently, ready to dismiss whatever it contained. His business associates continued their conversation, paying no attention to the small drama unfolding. As Thomas's eyes moved across the words, something changed in his face. The color drained away like water down a drain. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He blinked rapidly. Then he read the note a second time, more slowly. And then a third time. William stood perfectly still, watching. Around them, the restaurant continued as normal. Soft music played. Waiters moved between tables. Glasses clinked. But at Thomas Wilson's table, time seemed frozen. Thomas's hands began to tremble. The note shook like a leaf in a breeze. One of his business friends noticed and stopped talking mid-sentence. "Tom, everything all right?" Thomas didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the note, but he seemed to be seeing something else entirely, perhaps a hospital room from 3 years ago, or the face of his son. Across the restaurant, Robert Clark was signaling for their bill. His shoulders were slumped slightly, the only visible sign of his disappointment. Olivia reached across the table and touched his hand. She tried to maintain a brave smile for the children, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "We can still have ice cream at home," she said to Emily and James, who sat in uncomfortable silence. Their special dinner, saved for over months, had been reduced to a harsh lesson about how cruel the world could sometimes be. William felt a flash of anger as he looked at them. This family deserved better. This doctor who had saved lives deserved better. Suddenly, Thomas stood up. The movement was so abrupt that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. Every head in the restaurant turned. His business associates looked up at him in confusion. Thomas didn't notice. He was clutching the note in his hand so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. "Tom, what's going on?" one of his friends asked. Thomas straightened his tie with shaking fingers. He took a deep breath that seemed to fill his entire body. His face had gone from pale to flushed. "Excuse me," he said to his companions, his voice strangely tight. "There's something I need to do." William watched, his heart in his throat. Had he made a terrible mistake? Would Thomas make an even bigger scene now? Would Robert and his family face more humiliation? Would William be fired on the spot? Thomas turned away from his table. His eyes found William's, and for a brief moment something passed between them, not anger as William had expected, but something that looked almost like gratitude mixed with shame. Then Thomas Wilson, the feared and respected businessman, who owned half the luxury car dealerships in London, began walking across the restaurant toward the Clark family. Thomas stood nervously before the Clark family, his usual confidence gone. The restaurant remained silent, everyone watching this unexpected moment unfold. "I can't undo what I've said," Thomas admitted, his voice softer than before. "But I'd be honored if you would allow me to pay for your family's dinner tonight." Robert shook his head gently. "That's not necessary, Mr. Wilson." "Please," Thomas said, and for the first time that evening there was real emotion in his voice. "Not as payment. Nothing could pay for what you did for my family, but as a small gesture of apology and gratitude." Thomas turned to face the other diners who quickly pretended they hadn't been watching, but he wanted them to watch now. "I want everyone here to know that this man is a hero," Thomas announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the Royal Oak. "Not just for saving lives, but for doing it with dignity and asking for nothing in return." The restaurant remained quiet for a moment. Then an elderly man at a nearby table began to clap. Slowly, others joined in. The applause grew until it filled the room. William smiled from his position by the kitchen door, relief washing over him. Emily and James looked around in surprise. Their father's face showed a mix of embarrassment and pride. Olivia squeezed her husband's hand, tears finally spilling onto her cheeks. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. He borrowed a pen from a passing waiter and wrote something on the back. "My son Peter is studying medicine now," Thomas said, handing the card to Robert. "He was inspired by you. He'd be honored to meet you properly." Thomas paused, then added, "And I'm starting a scholarship fund for students who can't afford medical school. I'd like your thoughts on how to set it up." Robert looked at the card for a long moment, then nodded. "I think that's a conversation worth having, Mr. Wilson." Thomas smiled for the first time that evening. It transformed his face, making him appear younger and kinder. "Thank you, Dr. Clark." As Thomas turned to go back to his table, he stopped, beside William. Their eyes met and Thomas nodded slightly. "Thank you," he said quietly, pressing something into William's hand. "Some lessons are hard to learn, but necessary." William felt the folded paper between his fingers, but didn't look at it until later that night. When he did, he found not just the largest tip he'd ever received, but a note with Thomas Wilson's personal phone number and an offer to pay for the rest of his medical education. The Clark family stayed to finish their meal, the evening now transformed. The other diners stopped by their table on the way out, shaking Robert's hand or simply nodding respectfully. The restaurant manager brought complimentary desserts and apologized repeatedly. As the Clarks finally prepared to leave, Robert paused beside William near the coat check. "That took courage," Robert said, placing a hand on William's shoulder. "Standing up to someone powerful is never easy." William shook his head. "I just told the truth, sir." "Sometimes the truth is the bravest thing we can offer," Robert replied. "Sometimes it takes courage to remind people of their better selves." Outside, the London night was cool and clear. The Clark family walked together toward the underground station, closer than they had been before. Emily slipped her hand into her father's, something she hadn't done since she was little. "Dad," she said quietly, "I'm really proud you're my father." Inside the restaurant, Thomas Wilson rejoined his business associates, a changed man. He apologized for the interruption and ordered coffee for everyone. When the bill came, he added a generous tip for every staff member. William finished his shift with a lighter heart. Tomorrow he would call his grandmother and tell her she was right. Character matters. Truth matters. And sometimes people can change when reminded of who they really are. In a world where prejudice often casts long shadows, small acts of bravery can light the way back to our humanity. It's not the mistakes we make that define us, but how we respond when faced with the truth.